For taking the time to join us for our online event talking about the IT foundations for the future of digital health. For those who don't know me, my name is Rob Dawson. I'm the Head of Business Development here at Myrtec. We're an IT services provider specialising in managing IT for healthcare professionals and healthcare practices amongst other professional services firms. To get things underway today, we will be talking about a comparative analysis between recommendations from the Digital Health Agency, the Essential 8 framework, which comes from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and what we recommend at Myrtec, and the sort of the comparison between those three things and where, as a healthcare practice, we feel that you're best to invest your time and energy so that you can strike a good balance between, I think, good security and what's feasible and fit for purpose within a modern healthcare practice. So kicking things off, we'll talk about the Digital Health Agency's cybersecurity fundamentals. Now, it's a relatively short list. So if you go to the Digital Health Agency's website and have a look at their recommendations for healthcare providers and sort of the things that they recommend that you have in place in your practice, it's actually a pretty narrow list. So as we can see there, they say have regular software updates. So that's patching the software that you have with security patching. So software manufacturers, the same as like Microsoft releases patches for Windows, will release patches for the software that you have in your practice. They recommend that you update those regularly. Have strong passwords. I think that goes without saying. And having MFA turned on, so two-factor authentication, having a second factor of authentication for each of your passwords, for each of your accounts, for the things that you log into across your practice. Having regular data backups. So having backups in place that is off-site, so outside of the ecosystem that you work in, and having those happen regularly. Generally, best practice would say that you would have daily, weekly, monthly, so grandfather, father, son. It depends on what type of systems you're using, whether you're using a cloud-based solution, whether you still have on-premises infrastructure, or a mix of both as to what those backups are going to look like. But generally, when we talk about backups, we're talking about backing up everything in your entire environment and making sure that everything in each of those systems does have a third-party backup location. They say never respond to email phishing, so don't click on the links and don't put in your passwords. I think that one sort of goes without saying. And to not pay ransoms, which is sometimes easier said than done. Generally, it's easy to not pay ransoms when you do have data backups, because you can do a restoration, obviously, of your data backups to overcome the fact that your data's been encrypted. So that's one part of it. Generally, what we're seeing now is the exfiltration of data as well. So if someone ransomwares your data, they'll also steal a copy of that to seek the ransom. Otherwise, they'll publish that information out and sell that information on to somebody else. So easier said than done, but generally speaking, a reasonable recommendation. So as we can see, basically to meet the DHA's requirements or the suggestions for what you should be doing in your practice, install operating system and application software updates, as we sort of touched on, enforce password complexity. So you can enforce password complexity requirements in most software systems. So that includes within your sort of Windows, Microsoft or Google environment. If you're a Google client, you can enforce password complexity requirements across those. And most of the software applications, so the health-specific software application packages, allow you to force password complexity requirements as well. The other thing that you'll want to do is you'll want to enforce multi-factor authentication. Now, what we see is it's not always as easy to enforce multi-factor authentication across all of the software suite for all of the applications that you use every day. It's certainly easy enough to do within the Microsoft and the Google ecosystems that you'll operate from within. But some of the other software packages, it's a little bit harder to enforce the multi-factor authentication, but where the option is there to do that for all your team members within your practice, that's generally the recommendation, is to enforce that so that everybody has to use multi-factor authentication for all of their accounts. The next one is to implement backup software. So you'll need a third-party backup software, and that'll also need to be monitored and managed as well. So ensuring that the integrity of those backups, so A, that they're happening, B, that the integrity of the backup is correct, and C, the best way to test it is that you can actually do a restore of that data and the restoration works as well. As it says there, to an offsite location, so somewhere that sits outside of your ecosystem. So if your ecosystem gets compromised, you can restore back from the third-party location back into your environment. The next one to make sure that people aren't clicking on phishing links is training. We always say training, so awareness is one piece, but actually training people on what to identify, how to identify something that is phishing. Some of them are really, really, really good and really easy to dupe people with. So just having some training and just showing particularly the users within your environment, hey, this is how you can spot phishing emails. There's generally some telltale signs which are commonly sort of well hidden, but you can get them to check those things. And the last is to restore data from backups instead of needing to pay ransoms. That's assuming there's not an exfiltration of data. If there is an exfiltration of data and you don't know what you need to do about that, like our recommendation is generally have cyber insurance and speak to your insurer about the process, and they will generally walk you through what you should do either instead of paying the ransom. These are the pathways that you should take. All right, moving on to the Essential 8 framework from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. So these are basically 8 cybersecurity controls which the Australian Cybersecurity Centre recommends that all Australian businesses have in place. And they are to patch applications, so installing software application patches and security updates, patching your operating system, so this is just installing Windows updates, generally as soon as they're released, having multi-factor authentication turned on. So you can see there's a bit of a theme, there's a bit of overlap with the Digital Health Agency's recommendations as well. So having MFA turned on everything that you use. Restricting admin privileges. So this is a relatively good one. It's basically what we call separation of privileges. So the account that you use every day shouldn't have admin rights to anything within your ecosystem. You should have a separate account that you use for that. And the reason that that's the case is because all of the data that you have within your account that you use every day is commonly highly sensitive. If you have a separate admin account, it doesn't receive all of the emails and store all of the data that you have access to. So that's the one that you would use to go and do administrative functions within your environment. So we generally recommend nobody has admin privileges on their everyday user account. They should be separated. Application control, so controlling what applications are and are not allowed to work within your ecosystem. So that way, if a malicious piece of software comes into your environment, application control will essentially stop that from running. So that's a good control to have in place. Restricting Office macros. So Office macros are essentially bits of code or programs that run within your Microsoft Office applications, and Microsoft gives you the opportunity to, in certain instances, stop and block those things from running. So that's a recommendation under the Essential 8. User application hardening. So again, restricting things from within applications from running. So that's an example of that might be blocking scripts from running within a PDF document, which is something that can occur. So blocking those types of things from occurring and running, and of course, doing regular backups. Basically, under the Essential 8, it works on a maturity model. So there's 3 levels of maturity. So there's maturity level 1, which is generally targeted towards sort of small and medium enterprises. And it protects against large-scale attacks. So it's sort of that spray and pray. You send out, a bazillion phishing emails to the world, and you hope that somebody accidentally clicks on the link. It's not targeted. They're not specifically going after your business. That's what maturity level 1 is seeking to overcome. It's just sort of those large-scale attacks. Maturity level 2 is far more comprehensive. So within each of those 8 controls, there's basically a list of things, a list of checkboxes, and going, okay, these are the things that we expect you to have in place at maturity level 1. Once you get to maturity level 2, that list becomes much, much longer. So those controls become much, much tighter in your environment. And in medium to large business on maturity level 2, it's for more selective attacks. So
it's the difference between, an easy example is phishing versus spear phishing. So phishing is just spraying out a link to, as many email addresses as you can and hoping someone clicks the link. Spear phishing is where you go, okay, there's a business that I'm specifically going to target, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to design an email, and I'm going to ask them about something very, very specific. So you might be, for example, a radiology clinic, and they'll send something in and go, oh, hey, here's the details. I have a referral. It's contained within this link. I'm, getting in touch from, say, another practice. It might be a GP practice in town, and they'll impersonate them and they'll put the link in. That's spear phishing. So maturity level 2 is to overcome those targeted attacks where somebody's actually making an effort to try and directly target your business. And maturity level 3 is for government and enterprise. So critical infrastructure, they're generally trying to stop things like state-backed actors. So when we talk about state-backed actors, we're talking about other countries who are essentially sponsoring cyber criminals to try and hack infrastructure within other regions around the world. So maturity level 3 is there. Maturity level 3, within each of those 8 controls, there's hundreds of controls that sit within that they would expect you to have configured and enabled around your IT ecosystem to be able to protect the assets that are sitting behind that. So most of the organizations that we work with from an Essential 8 perspective will generally sit in the maturity level 1 category. There's some organizations that we work with that are moving towards maturity level 2. They're a bit bigger and have a bit more sensitive data and a bit higher of a risk profile, so they are potentially a target. But for most organizations we work with, generally maturity level 1. All right, so meeting the Essential 8 requirements. This is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated. So to meet Essential 8 requirements, you can't just enable things that are already contained within your ecosystem. You're actually going to need third-party tools to be able to deliver it. There's a bunch of stuff that needs to be configured within those 8 controls that not only needs to be configured the first time, but also needs to be monitored and managed on an ongoing basis. And the bigger and more complex your environment is, the harder it is to deliver the Essential 8 requirements. And we'll sort of touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. So Essential 8 also has a wider scope and higher complexity. So it basically touches on lots of sort of different areas across the business, and the depth in which the controls apply is a little bit deeper than particularly those sort of security fundamentals that were recommended by the Digital Health Agency. These ones will go a lot deeper. So we're talking about controls within applications themselves, and then being able to monitor and manage those controls that we inject into applications. So to stop things like scripts and bits and pieces running from within the Office ecosystem, for example. And the Essential 8 scope includes unmanaged assets as well. So when we talk about unmanaged assets, from an IT provider's perspective, we'll have what's called managed assets. And that might be your computers, that might be software licensing for things like your Office Productivity Suite, being Microsoft or Google. You might have hosted infrastructure or servers hosted in the cloud, and they might be a managed asset. Then there's a range of unmanaged assets that sit in your ecosystem. So unmanaged assets from an IT perspective might be things like specific software that you use within your practice that your IT provider doesn't look after for you. They just say, oh, that's your responsibility. Essential 8 includes those within the scope of coverage for things like application patching, for example. So they'll then need to be brought into scope and become a managed asset. So it sort of increases the scope of what the IT provider needs to do and what needs to be managed on an ongoing basis. So that's some of the complexities with meeting the Essential 8 requirements. Basically, where did it come from? A bit of history about it. So it was developed by the Australian Signals Directorate, which is a division within the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. Basically, they went out in 2017 and they went out to industry leaders and just went, hey, what we need to develop some mitigation strategies that sort of is going to apply to sort of all businesses in Australia. Come to the table and let us know, what are the most important ones. And what we'll do is we'll start to put this together as a list. And basically they sort of went out, they did all of that, they got all of that feedback and implemented these 8, which they call essential strategies. Now, one of the things that probably from our perspective we would say about that is who they went and sought feedback from
it clearly, based on the 8 that they come up with, is people from, particularly from government, or who works very, very closely with government, because the 8 controls that they talk about are sort of very government and enterprise focused. So if you go into a sort of government ecosystem, which is my background, if you go into a government ecosystem, those 8 things apply really, really, really well. If you come out to small business where you have a more sort of diverse range of sort of software products and applications, you might have people sitting on Windows or on Mac, maybe in the Google ecosystem, you've got a whole range of other products that sit within there that are specific to your practice and your business and what you do. The Essential 8 don't necessarily apply to a lot of those. So yeah, that's sort of where it came from and why it looks the way that it looks. All right, so for us, we developed back in 2020, we started developing a list of minimum standards for our clients. So what we noticed with the Essential 8 is it probably wasn't comprehensive enough and didn't really reflect, sort of good security posture for a lot of our small to medium sized customers. And again, it sort of just comes back to that, those 8 things are really good for government, but what about all the rest of the stuff? Now, within industry, there's a whole bunch of best practices that sort of we talk about and have been brought up on over the last sort of, for me, over 20 years now, that aren't really encapsulated in what the DHA talks about, so the Digital Health Agency and their cybersecurity fundamentals, or what's included within the Essential 8. There's a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So we've developed our minimum standards, and what we'll do is we'll just run through what those are and why we think that they're appropriate, and generally a little bit easier for people to be able to get into. So our minimum standards are to have a business-grade antivirus, an anti-malware product that sits across all of the devices within your ecosystem. We used to talk about antivirus a lot. It's one of those things where people don't seem to get viruses as much anymore. Generally, that's a reflection of the maturity within that space around the products that sit within there. And some of it sort of comes by default, but generally speaking, the business grade products will protect against things like ransomware and bits and pieces, which we hear about more now. So we generally recommend have a business grade antivirus product sitting on your devices across the entirety of your ecosystem. Having encryption enabled, so encrypt the data that sits on your devices. One of the ways that data can be lost and a data breach can occur is when devices are either lost or stolen, and basically they can just pull the hard drive out of the device and all of the data is just sitting there in clear text. Best practice from an industry perspective is have data encrypted in transit and at rest. So that means, when you're sort of, you've heard people talking about, have a VPN so that you can anonymize and secure your data as it's in transit is a really good example of that, or a really relatable example. What happens is though, if you don't have it encrypted at rest, they can just sort of steal it from the other end once it gets there. So what we want to have is data encrypted in transit and at rest. The next thing is to have DMARC configured. So DMARC, and for anyone who's old enough, will probably remember this from back in the day, we used to call it spoofing. People would spoof your email address and they would send an email and say that they're you, and it would have the correct email address there. DMARC is essentially to protect against that. So it's the sort of a more modern form of being able to protect your email domain from being misused by other people. SPF is the same thing. So it's called its sender policy framework. It basically is a control against your email domain to make sure that stuff that you're sending out is definitely coming from approved locations. So, be that Microsoft or Google, or you might send stuff from MailChimp, for example, or from your practice management software as well. Restricting end user admin access. So stripping away admin rights from end users so they can't install software and bits and pieces onto their computers. Exclude security policy. So we basically want to have exclusions in place to be able to block certain things from being able to be installed, and make sure that we have sort of some control over what's happening within the ecosystem. Making sure that your Microsoft Office version is up to date and that your operating system is also up to date. So again, that's talking about patching applications and patching operating systems, but making sure that you're on supported versions of those as well. So you are still actually receiving security updates from those product manufacturers. We also generally recommend that data is stored in Australia, and we actually assess across applications and infrastructure that is under management, so managed assets with us, that the data is stored in Australia. we recommend that RDP, so that's remote desktop, is disabled. So being able to remote into your computers that are sitting in your office environment, generally recommend that we disable that, or that we at least secure that effectively. Disabling and limiting external sharing. So we make sure that external sharing is auditable. Making sure that you have a security score. So within Microsoft and Google, you can basically get a security score against what they recommend as their best practices to have configured within their ecosystem. We track the security score to make sure that that's being met. And same thing for Google Workspace. Multi-factor authentication, again, I think is a given. Having a password manager in place is another big one. We always recommend that all of our clients have a password manager to store all of their passwords in, instead of having them on sticky notes on their monitors and stored in Excel spreadsheets, because that's not particularly secure, and that they have regular backups in place. Now, for us and for our clients, we actually manage this on an ongoing basis. So all of these things that are listed in our standards, we have monitor all of those to make sure that they're being met, and they get brought together in a compliance report. So this is just a sample of what that looks like. So basically it's what it is. And these are the compliance alerts for where potentially our clients are non-compliant. And generally what we want to do is we want to make sure that they get to a compliance standard to tick all of those boxes. So where do they come from? I think we sort of touched on this a little bit earlier, but they were developed to make sure that sort of our customers would be eligible for cyber insurance. There was a whole bunch of stuff that sort of is best practice in industry, things that we've learned over the years, things that are most effective and fit for purpose. And then in 2020, we went down the path. People were talking about cyber insurance. It was becoming a thing. And more people were getting into that, but the cyber insurers were coming back and going, hey, no, you sort of need to meet all of these requirements first. And the early iterations of our compliance report were to do that. So we could basically go back to insurers and go, hey, here's our clients and here's where they're ticking all of these boxes. That's sort of where it all began. We then added in things like best practices from industry, best practices from the manufacturers. So they'd be Microsoft or Google, for example. But the other thing that we did is we went through and went, what do our customers actually use? So we were talking about, there was a spread between Windows and Mac devices. There was a spread between Microsoft and Google for their email, for example. And we went, okay, what we need is something that's more broadly comprehensive that can cover all of those things and then apply them dynamically as well. So for our clients, and this is just as an example of probably what you should be seeking to do, we go, okay, well, here's, say 30 or 40 things. This client, only 30 of these things apply. So we're just going to monitor those 30 things for them and try and up their compliance around those 30 items, because they might be on Mac computers with Google, for example. So all of the Windows and Microsoft stuff doesn't apply. So generally that's a dynamic list that gets applied, so we can do that. And because it's constantly evolving, the IT landscape and the security landscape, that list, or our compliance list, also changes. So we add things in there as new things come up, and new things get fed back to us from cyber insurers going, okay, well, we're not going to offer insurance unless they can demonstrate they have these things in place. There's also further stuff that might come through from the Australian Signals Directorate going, hey, this is a potential vulnerability point, or this is at risk. Here is our best recommendation for doing this. And we'll add those things on a compliance basis ongoing. Now, one of the things you will have noticed, we've probably touched on the same thing across each of the sort of the DHA's fundamentals, the Essential 8 and Myrtec's recommendations. We've touched on the same thing multiple times within each of those. So there is actually a fair bit of overlap in each of these frameworks. So we can see here that there's actually quite a lot of overlap between the DHA's cyber fundamentals recommendations, the Australian Cyber Security Centre's Essential 8, and Myrtec's minimum recommendations as well. So you can see there things like regular software updates, MFA, and regular backups exist within all of them. And that's important to know, because essentially what that means is it doesn't matter which sort of framework you're trying to align to. Those are by far the most important things. You've got sort of 3 different places recommending to do at least those exact same things. But where there's overlap, it's good, because if you do any of those, it means that you're starting to tick the box in some of the others as well. So the frameworks themselves, and while ours might look like a really long list, ours isn't actually that difficult to achieve. It's just configuring commonly stuff that you already have or that you should have, and it will start to address criteria in some of the others as well. So some additional ways that you can be extra secure beyond the recommendations from the DHA or from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre or from us is to make sure that you do training. We did touch on it briefly about early on in the security fundamentals from the DHA about how you protect yourself from sort of phishing attacks and making sure that your staff know how to identify when it's a phishing email is training. Do the training. It's worth the investment of time, not only to protect your practice and to protect your patients and clients, but also to ensure that you don't become another statistic or assist cyber criminals to keep hopping. So that's the other thing that happens, is that generally they'll breach one place and then it makes it easier to breach other places. So what you can do is make sure that your staff are trained, they're educated, they know what's happening, and they can identify when those phishing things are coming through. If you are somebody who goes out of the office and travels around, you probably have mobile devices, or your staff have mobile devices. Implement mobile device management. So secure those mobile devices to make sure that you're not hemorrhaging data from those mobile devices as you're cruising around. Implement data loss prevention. So making sure that you have policies in place that will at least audit and potentially stop data from leaving your ecosystem that meets certain criteria. So that might be, say, patient data, for example. That might be credit card information, whatever that happens to be. You can set those controls so that that data can't leave your organization. Turning on advanced email security. So the more email security you can put in place, the better protected you'll be. Making sure that you have strong policies and procedures. So people, process, technology is what we always talk about. Having strong policies and procedures for how to do things and how to manage things, particularly in the event of a cyber incident, is really, really important. Enabling things like conditional access, so access being granted under certain conditions or blocked under certain conditions, is just a more tailored approach to the way that you can essentially give access to users to be able to access things within your ecosystem. You can do network hardening, so that's implementing or introducing firewalls, VPN access, things like that, to protect the data that sits behind that, so doing network hardening that way. And of course, meeting the Essential 8 compliance. So adding the Essential 8 on top of any cybersecurity framework that you already have in place is a great way to continue to harden your environment. So the next thing is, why does this even matter? Why does compliance actually matter? So there's been a whole raft of changes happening around privacy and security and data, and directors can be held personally liable if they fail to manage cybersecurity risks adequately. So we're starting to see some stuff go through the courts now where ASIC is pursuing companies who have inadequately protected the data of their clients. To meet the obligations of your cyber insurance policy, we'd hate to think that you've lied on your insurance policy about meeting their requirements, and we would hate to see someone get breached and then not be eligible to claim against that insurance because they haven't actually met those requirements. There's obviously the loss or theft of sensitive data and the disruption to critical services that would happen as a consequence of that. And of course, the reputational damage that would come with that as well, if it was found out that your organisation was breached and you lost data, particularly sensitive data on behalf of your clients. There's also legal and financial penalties. As I'd mentioned, there's been some changes around the Privacy Act and what is happening there. So there are now stronger legal and financial penalties for negligence, particularly around cyber and loss of data on behalf of clients. And then, of course, you end up with a loss of stakeholder trust, which again sort of ties into that reputational damage piece that you don't want to end up being there or end up being a statistic. So which one should you go for? Which do we recommend? Well, the DHA's recommendations for cybersecurity aren't really comprehensive enough. They're sort of a good way to get started if you don't have those things in place already. It's 2025. I would suspect that most organizations would have most of those things in place, at least as a minimum, but they're probably not strong enough and comprehensive enough for the types of threats and the intensity of threats that we're seeing now, particularly post-COVID. Those threats are consistent, and those threats are happening all the time. And those recommendations probably aren't comprehensive enough to meet the requirements of most organizations. The Essential 8 is sort of good depending on the type of organisation you are, but it can be expensive to implement and maintain. And it doesn't offer the breadth of coverage either. So what we identified for a lot of our clients is if they implemented the Essential 8 without implementing the other stuff from our sort of minimum recommendations, it did leave them exposed in quite a few areas. So I think if you were entirely on Microsoft stack and it was sort of, government department-esque, then it may be appropriate for you. But it's expensive to introduce, and it's not going to be as secure as you could be for the amount of money that you would invest into delivering that. So while we're not opposed to it, generally we would recommend having that or meeting the Essential 8 in addition to making sure that you have all of the fundamentals in place within your environment. And I think where we tend to sway to is we tend to go, okay, so somewhere between DHA and the Essential 8 is probably where our minimum standards are. They're generally not too expensive to implement those things. They are grounded in a couple of really sort of good bases for cyber. So one being cyber insurance and making sure that you're eligible for cyber insurance and to reduce your premiums against that if you're ticking all of those boxes as part of our minimum standards. It's also not that expensive to implement. Most of it's built on infrastructure that you already have. So you get really good bang for buck, and it's dynamic. So it sort of works across the ecosystem that you have instead of forcing you into an ecosystem to meet those requirements as well. So lots of the stuff within our minimum requirements are there. Generally, for most of our clients, we would say like at least do all of our minimum requirements, those fundamentals, to give you a wide sort of coverage of your cybersecurity posture. And from there, then look at introducing additional frameworks like Essential 8 on top of that to increase your security from that standpoint. So the key takeaways from today, and write these down. I don't know that you have to. You might get a copy of the presentation at the end of this. But we'd say that the DHA's recommendations aren't enough. It's just not comprehensive enough in 2025. And I think you probably need to be doing more than that to protect not only the interests of your business, but also the interests of your patients of whom you're holding their data for them. And quite commonly, that's going to be sensitive data. If you have a managed IT provider, ask them to complete a cyber health audit and just give you a report and just make sure you're ticking all of those boxes. Like I said, I think a copy of this presentation will get sent out. It'll have the list of stuff in there. That's something you can share with them and go, hey, are we ticking all of these boxes? Like this is 2025. This is probably a really good minimum standard that we should be at least trying to work towards. If you don't have cyber insurance, apply for it. Cost of the premiums will give you an insight generally into how secure they think you are. We always say if you can't pay someone to take on the risk for your business, then the risk is probably too high. So once the insurer will say, yep, we'll insure you tick enough of our boxes, your risk profile is pretty low, we're happy to accept the risk for that. You know that you're probably in a relatively good sort of position if you have the eligibility for cyber insurance, and the premium is not an exorbitant amount for the size of business that you are. Train your people, train them. Get them educated, have a good, positive sort of cybersecurity culture within your practice where people talk about it, share things around and help each other out. Some structured or formalized training is always useful as well, just to make sure that people that might not be as engaged have to go and are forced to go through some stuff, just so that you know that at least they've got some fundamental level of training about, how to identify things like phishing, how to identify attacks and what to do in the event of an attack. And the other thing is to have appropriate policies in place. So let people know what they can and can't do with your environment and within your ecosystem to make sure that you're protecting your data. They're not doing things that are potentially risky and potentially going to create a threat or an opportunity for cyber criminals to breach your environment. And that's it from us. So thank you for those who've joined us here this morning. At the end of this, you'll probably receive some communications from either myself or Sky, just with a copy of the presentation. We won't do a Q&A. We'll save that for after the webinar. But thank you again for coming along, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks a lot.